I think you all are well aware data are critical to informing decision-making practices, which consequently impact upon our ways of life and vitality as Indigenous Australians. Despite this, Indigenous Australians lack the necessary tools to assert control of Indigenous data in meaningful ways which enable them to derive value or focus upon the priorities determined by their communities. And of course, effective, it's not so far away from that effective governance of data is critical to the self-determination of those individuals, families, communities, and collectives about whom data is amassed. Indigenous data when we talk about. And all of this together forms part of what we consider data assets, and that is extremely important. So I just share that with a little bit of premise for this session. It's also particularly crucial for data that are gathered without the informed consent and active participation of those involved, which a lot of that historical material, as we've touched on already, has been collected in ways that we would consider unethical in a modern day context, be that the way that data is described or even the way that data has been gathered and or extracted. So we'll talk more about some of those concepts later as we get into the panel in depth. Also too, nothing about us without us is pertinent in the management of historical Indigenous cultural and social data, as well as in contemporary decision making regarding its stewardship. And there really is an imperative that Indigenous peoples should be fully engaged in all aspects of decision making concerning their data, thereby upholding their rights to autonomy and self-determination in the governance of that. Of their data. We also know that Indigenous Australians are the most over-researched populations upon the planet. Among those, also, one of the significant parts of that is, despite being over-researched, we still derive the least amount of benefit, research benefit. And research benefit thus far, that has never centred our priorities. So we'll also, as we go on, we will start to consider what the state of being truly self-determined may mean within the so-called Australian landscape and the Indigenous data governance landscape or ecosystem that is evolving with this tide of authentic enthusiasm among the many different communities of practice and individuals that we have been engaging with thus far. Lastly, in opening this presentation, I'll remind you that it is against the backdrop of colonisation that we, as descendants and Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, are consequently framed, like it or not. We must be conscious of the ways in which this impacts our ways of thinking, feeling, and behaving, and ultimately responding. So I want to let that sink in for a moment too. We are, of course, socialised to think, feel and behave based on where we have come from and our experiences in life, both good and bad. So I hope that provides a bit of preface for today's conversation. Now over to you. We have had some conversations already around very different types of data. You've looked at definitions. I think the gravity of the situation in terms of data being extremely broad is not new now. We've got that. So that part of this question, I suppose, is lost. But we'll keep it in there because I'm curious to see, of those who want to share, can you give me an example? What do you consider to be Indigenous data, or Indigenous data that you're mostly concerned with your day-to-day practice, whatever that may be? And just elaborating on that, what does it look like within your area of practice? So we've got the mic runners, and I would be really privileged. As I said, these sessions are based on, the value of it is based on what our audience members contribute, so please feel comfortable in sharing. That's extremely appreciated. But what I'm looking for here is just a bit of a very short sort of introduction, who you are and what your area of focus is, be that research work or otherwise, and what types of data that you might be looking at. Down the front here. Thank you. And just, and let us know your name too.
Thank you. Ruth Farrell from Queensland Health. I work with our First Nations Health Office. I'm a digital translator for that team as they're looking at adopting generative AI technology in their services. And the question the biggest challenge that I have is the Indigenous data that we're working with there is trained on all of the data that's on the internet that has not been published with Indigenous Data Governance or Indigenous Data Sovereignty. And it creates data. The generative AI then creates data that is being used and ingested by our services, and it hasn't got governance or sovereignty over it either. And we mentioned AI very briefly earlier, but I'm really interested to hear if anybody is actively working on AI and Indigenous data.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing. Who else? Do you want to chime into this conversation too as we go? Yeah. Can you jump up? Yeah.
Hello, I'm Alex. I'm from First Languages Australia, and I look at language data naturally, which also is a lot about metadata. But something I'm also really interested in is how do we measure success in languages and language acquisition, etc.
Very good. So 2 examples already, very different types of data. Now we're getting a few hands.
Hi, my name is Thomasina Donovan. I'm from QT, looking at health services research. So far, our projects, or the ones I've been involved in, haven't focused on Indigenous, projects, but often in all of our projects we collect participant characteristics, of which one is always the participant of Indigenous status. So I just here to upskill on what we do with that.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Frankie. I'm from NAJA, which is the North Australian Aboriginal Justice Agency. So I manage a database full of data about all of our clients and the services that we provide to our clients. And I'm particularly interested in how we measure success, because all of the, data items that we're required to collect are dictated by the government as our funder, and they're not at all tied to the value of the service we provide. So I'm really interested in us taking control of the narrative.
That's a good one. You got anything to chime in yet? Or he's just charging up in these, getting energised here. You can come sit up here, sit in front of these mics if you want. Just sit, relax there, and then chime in when you want. All right, who else we got? Down the front here.
Yeah, I'm Daniel Featherstone at RMIT University. We've been doing a project in remote First Nations communities across the country measuring digital inclusion, so doing a survey which maps to the Australian Digital Inclusion Index, and also interviews with community and giving all of that data back to each community as the partner organisation that we work with, as part of their own, to do use for their own planning and advocacy. And we're just embarking on a national data collection to measure Closing the Gap Target 17, which is a digital inclusion target. Going back to all that story about the communications access people have in the APY lands and other places, that's all the stuff we're measuring. So, Heron Loban, who's Now, on the project is our First Nations lead researcher on that national project. So I'll just quickly hand over to Heron to introduce.
Oh dear. That was not a pass I was expecting. So my name is Associate Professor Heron Loban. I'm a Torres Strait Islander woman, and just started on this new project, which has really come out of some of the work of the First Nations Digital Inclusion Advisory Group, of which I'm a member, looking at how do we close the gap for our people, our communities, not just in remote areas, but also now in regional, urban, wherever we live as Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. So we'll be collecting a lot of data and wanting to ensure that that can be used by our people to close the gap and for other purposes that they might see it having a useful. Yes, sir.
That's wonderful. I think you made such a great point in the fact of talking about the inclusion and, this idea or this concept that, digital inclusion impacts rural and remote or, these very kind of extreme geographies. It is so, sent to the point of that, in micro environments and particularly even within, metropolitan context, digital exclusion, digital inclusion, either side of that coin affects, just as much. Narratively, in Victoria, before I come on board with this body of work, was working as the State Manager of Clinical Excellence through the Victorian Aboriginal Community Control Health Service. It's the peak body, for context, is the equivalent of Quake here in Queensland. And what we found with our 32 member services is that, you are, in some instances, some of these services, at such significant, exclusion and digital exclusion, you might as well have been in the desert as well. And so it's really important for people to remember that, right? That geography isn't discriminate and it doesn't, dictate people's positioning in that. So it's just such a lovely point that you've raised as well.
Thank you all for really sharing. We might let's have maybe two more and then we'll roll on.
Hi, I'm Michaela from Women and Children's Hospital in Adelaide. I work in toxinology, so I'm quite looking at Indigenous knowledge around envenomations and treatment of and the flora and fauna, and looking at things like data that might include yarning circle and that kind of knowledge, and looking at that and how to manage all that in a good way.
Hi, I'm working with mortality data, so particularly area level mortality data, so rates of ages of certain types of fatalities with First Nations communities and matching that against variances of community identified protective factors such as percentage of people speaking an Indigenous language or attendance at cultural events to look at protective effects, so kind of on both ends of different types of data.
Incredibly important work, and you start to see all the different linkages and the true power behind data, right? And the power that comes from putting blackfellas behind the steering wheel. It doesn't just happen though, we're already overtaxed with everything else we need to do, day-to-day lives, and then across different disciplines, departments, all the rest of it, blackfellas are overutilised, under-resourced and tired and the rest of it. So it's a lot of those considerations too, But you see this incredibly important work happening, but the idea of this exercise is really just to demonstrate clearly for everyone the real diversity of Indigenous data and the magnitude of amounts that are out there, where they are, and the rest of it.
Can I also just say too, you made a point of saying that Indigenous populations are over-researched, and look, there's truth in that. But I think, more to the point, And when we bring it right back to data, and when we bring it back to this, capture aspect of data and attainment, I think, again, let's also fold into that conversation and hold at equal weight is the idea of surveillance, right? It's about surveying. So, there are plenty of people, including, several really kind of distinguished academics who would argue that we just don't nearly have enough research done about Indigenous peoples. Not good, ethical, moral-driven, community-decided research. However, what we do have is an overabundance of surveying, right? There has been, and to filter back to health, there's been an exsanguination of data that has been extruded from Indigenous populations and communities. And, we're not just talking about census data, we're talking about data being captured and surveyed with little to no context and at a rate that we don't really kind of, perceptively know how to quantify. So just a caveat to that point.
Thank you. Thank you all for sharing. We will be coming back to these sort of things as we go, and so treat that as a little warm-up. And again, we'll keep that engagement going. I'm going to move through a few slides now between now and our panel session. So I'm just going to start to touch on these concepts and get a little bit more in depth into them. And Levi, if you just chime in when you want, or whichever. Okay, so looking at okay, so we're starting to consider things around, call it what you want, but we're looking at effectively, in one way or another, Indigenous rights to exercise greater control over data. One of the troubles with that is it doesn't feature prominently within the Australian legislature, and it hasn't, thus far. We have many, many frameworks that have come from different areas. I'm going to show you some of those as we go, international examples. The implementation of a lot of those frameworks still remains, I guess, at the discretion of those respective institutions, or at the goodwill, or their sort of social license to operate, or social pressure, those kind of things. So often when I talk about the coalition of the willing, it is because those are the groups that we are often engaging with, because there is no requirement necessarily to do these, to make these types of reforms. That body of work is coming. As Levi mentioned at the start, there's a lot of scholarship that is starting in this space. There's a lot more discourse that is flowing around, that's consequently then informing the different decisions that government are making. One of the biggest milestones is that NIA whole of government framework, which Levi was part of its establishment too. So looking at this concept here, data sovereignty is actually not a new concept. It's been around since the 1970s, but we have seen this idea of Indigenous data sovereignty come back in terms of there being a resurgence around 2007 with the drafting of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, which reaffirms Indigenous peoples' rights to self-determination as political entities. So we're using some of these different words and terminologies which we're going to maybe pack into and start to see what they are. I will remind you they're all English words, so they all come with their own framing. So that's why sometimes we've got the same words that are meaning slightly different things. So I'm going to give you a perspective on that as we go, and Levi will give you one, and we'll all share those. So it's about the rights to self-determination as political entities, but it also honours the principle of Indigenous control over Indigenous data. And so from that now we see these evolving disciplines that are the ideals around Indigenous data sovereignty, but also to the actualisation of that through Indigenous data governance mechanisms and reform. Okay. Yep, so Indigenous data governance is the mechanism to give effect to Indigenous data sovereignty, and given the evolving nature of it, there is still a little bit of work, particularly that remains around the actual implementation and the translation of these ideals into practice, which is a lot of the work in which my colleagues, Levi and others, we have all been working very actively, particularly with the HAS and ARDC, to describe and publish in a way that adds value to these communities. So that's some of the work that we've been doing already. And it's also, we'll note that the Australian Legislature does not accurately reflect the data needs of Indigenous individuals and communities currently. So these are the principles, the Maimnari Wingara principles that I won't read out, but we'll just look through some of those. One of the terminologies that I think is important in understanding this work going forward is around what does sovereignty mean, how is that actualised today in modernity versus how was it or was it even considered historically in those sort of contexts as well. It's important to recognise the locally, like what's happening globally, but also to locally at home within so-called Australia, particularly noting the ostensible nature of the Australian Legislature under the Crown and the Westminster system. I think that needs to be understood, particularly around the history of founding what we consider to be a settler colonial state or a nation state, either or, leading up into the development of a constitution. So those are provocative thoughts to sit with you for a little bit, and how that works in the absence of formal treaties and that being enshrined as part of that constitutional process. Challenging things to consider. So then we leave Australia and we have a look at some other examples around the continent, and we start to look at what's happened perhaps in Canada or the United States of America, particularly around Native Nations or First Nations groups acting as independent political entities, and what sovereignty means over there. I'll just touch on this point, particularly, now this comes at a time around 1830 in the United States of America, where we established this concept of domestic dependent sovereignty. Now, that came about in a US Supreme Court decision that was the Cherokee Nation versus the state of Georgia. This is 1831, and Chief Justice John Marshall described Indigenous tribes as domestic dependent nations. So this recognised at that time that those groups had a degree of internal sovereignty. They governed themselves and their internal affairs, but are also dependent on the US federal government in matters like foreign relations and certain aspects of governance. So there still is, some people might take with that and think, is that sovereignty? Is that almost sovereignty? What does that mean? I'm not making a comment on that, but it is still a degree, there is still a degree of legal and political subordination to the federal government there. I guess I did make an opinion on it. However, one thing that it does do is it supports that fundamental right of self-determination, which links back to UNDRIP and some of the things that we're talking about. So I share this not to upset a sense of identity or our authenticity as a legitimate nation state versus our perhaps halfway in between status as a settler colonial state or wherever you sit, and the arguments around that. Don't say this to upset or disconcert that, but it's really to try and to consider the multifaceted areas that fall within this notion of sovereignty and where that comes from. And I'll remind us, it is a European-derived terminology that we are, again, applying to an Indigenous context that involves Indigenous data, which you all know is extremely broad and diverse and complex. And we couple that with the challenge of, not the challenge, but the reality of the complex ways of knowing, being, doing, and the rest of it when we look at Indigenous ways, Indigenous worldviews. Okay, and so finally, just on that point, now it's clear through the literature and through the Indigenous people here today and others, we can acknowledge that Indigenous individuals and communities maintain inherent interests in Indigenous data by virtue of their distinct identity, and they absolutely have a right to do that. So we'll use a term like knowledge economy and talk about data assets to couple that with that terminology. I'll share this with you briefly. So Professor Maggie Walter talks about this Indigenous data paradox. She believes we have both too much and too little data. And I think this is a useful tool because it's somewhat provocative in thought and can inspire robust conversation on this matter, as we've already had, as we've started on. So that's a good thing. A lot of this is, I believe, largely generated from census or specific surveys and different types of administrative data that has been collected and amassed within various government departments. So it has a little bit of a social science view to it. So things like hospital data, healthcare data, school data, justice system data and Centrelink data, those kinds of things. One of the things she does point out is around this. So it says, it gives a landscape of perhaps what the Indigenous data landscape looks like in terms of the things that we have: blaming data, aggregated data, decontextualised data, deficit, government priority data, or restricted access data. And then it gives you a view of some of the things that she believes that we need in terms of the way we should be viewing Indigenous data in that landscape. One of the things that we'll point out, and I think it's great for rigorous conversation around this, is this concept of deficit data, and often a lot of historical data reports Indigenous individuals, communities, and the rest of it in a deficit view, and perhaps doesn't give a clear picture of the problems or the health problems or social problems, etc. Doesn't give a clear view of where those things have come from. And in that instance, it is decontextualised. But we talk about this deficit view. The challenge that remains with that one, though, is sometimes deficit data may need to be appropriate, particularly when Indigenous communities, Indigenous practitioners need to take lead on their own research outputs, particularly that, again, the social scientists idea, and out there working with things, some pretty tough challenges like domestic violence, alcohol and drug use, those kind of, and preventable diseases as well, which are all legitimate problems that are affecting our communities day to day. So sometimes the deficit data may be misconstrued with calling a spade a spade. Does that make sense? So there's times where we need to couple that with that one. So I think that one's quite important to acknowledge too. You're looking at me like I said.
No, I agree with that. Sorry,
Right.
I was thinking too deeply on the question itself. But
Okay.
yeah, no.
Don't hang me out to dry.
Yeah, no, I think there's definitely. To extend on that, Professor Walter really kind of positions the idea that data is never neutral, and that with that, I understand the argument in one sense, but also data is neutral, a gun's neutral, Do you know what I mean? A gun is only as dangerous as the intent and the person's ability to use it in such a way. No different to data. Both have catastrophic outcomes. But also, in saying that, it's a tool at the end of the day, right? So let's not demonise as far as a tool. And yeah, maybe a gun wasn't probably the best one. Let's say a knife is probably a better instrument, and, it can be just as fatal. Both of them have, a purpose as far as a tool and its usefulness. And certainly as far as, data being neutral, again, I said earlier, it comes back down to attitude, habituated ways of thinking, doing and working, and particularly, the way that we are institutionalised in our jobs, in the environments in which we work, to participate in those old, crappy practices of the way we do things. But, yeah.
Yeah. Okay, so I want to share this. This is off the back of me talking previously around, Indigenous worldviews not being perhaps, and Indigenous data needs not being reflected in current Australian legislation and the rest of it, and that challenge still remains, and also to the everlasting challenge to combine these different ways of, these different worldviews, these different ways of being, knowing, doing, and the rest of it. So one example I'll give to you is, this was done by a way of consultative reporting. Now, this was where both Zara and Williams argued that the Western governance lens does not adequately understand the full impact that colonisation has had on the Indigenous human, physical and sacred worlds, often compromising the Indigenous episteme and worldviews. So they said, when it comes to Indigenous governance, the Western lens often fails to accept, appreciate that Indigenous peoples of Australia managed to govern their day-to-day lives effectively for millennia, while exhibiting the complete array of human intellect and also respecting the right of their neighbours across the continent to manage their societies with their own specific style of Indigenous governance based on their law and custom. So there is an increasing awareness now of the recognition of Indigenous data as an asset class, which Indigenous individuals and communities held interests prior to the assertion of sovereignty over so-called Australia by Britain in 1770. So we are still here, and despite the enduring impacts of colonisation, there is now, we see a gradual realisation that we maintain those inherent interests in Indigenous data. Now I'm going to get my phone here, not to check a text message. Well, I'm going to check a text message because I just want to read this out. So as you know, this runs alongside, this event is the sort of start of the week, and then the rest of the week will be the summer school that will be held at St. Lucia. So both ARDC events, Hassanai events, and so one of those authors is Uncle Grant, who might come later on, but he sent me this and I thought it might be important, so I want to just read it out. And he said, just remember our law, L-O-R-E, our governance, and in brackets he's put, which has always been present and not something new that has been inspired or expected. So just remember our law, our governance, as a requirement to now meld with the Western governance, has and should always be about acting with cultural honour and integrity and behaving with cultural dignity and humility, all of which focus on maintaining balance and harmony across our natural, physical and sacred worlds, and all things interlinked within these three worlds. That's ancient governance, where we all remain interconnected and accountable to each other, and all things around us that sustain our survival as ancient people, culture and civilization. So those of you who are aware with some of his stuff, that sounds very much like his words. I'll just share too that beyond the Australian context, Indigenous governance systems are further developed in other regions globally, and if we look to the United States, we've got the work of Miriam Jorgensen at the University of Arizona, and a lot of this work, and beyond her scholarship as well, but a lot of this work has been somewhat strong across the past 50 years. So the term rebuilding native nations encompasses much of this, and it illustrates how native nations across the American continent assert their rights to self-determination through varied governance instruments and structures, ranging from a diverse sample of different governance examples and models. So I just wanted to reference that because all of these things, I hope, if they're of interest, they're worth going and having a look, because they can inform a lot of the conversations that we're having as we go. I think Australia is, in comparison with a lot of those other ones, relatively fresh in terms of embarking on this type of work. So governance is a broad discipline unto itself, and it's also something that's a prominent feature across many different disciplines and various fields of study. So it's something that's consistent across all. It's so broad, in fact, that no consensus has been made on its definitions, despite a multiplicity of definitions existing and emerging across various fields, each highlighting different aspects and depending on its context. So there is a lack of consensus. However, what this does do is it underscores that there's this flexibility of governance as a concept, reflecting its application across the diverse fields and within day-to-day life, from informal social structures to complex institutional frameworks. So it is quite diverse, and I mean, I'll throw a definition of my own. However, it is in part consisting of key constituents that form the basis for informed and substantiated decision-making by an appropriate delegation of individuals, which extend to specific roles and responsibilities. It encompasses a wide range of concepts, processes and structures related to decision-making, authority and accountability. So the three things I do want to, impart with you on this, that I would highlight is around it being informed, around it being substantiated in terms of decision-making, informed and substantiated, and by who, that it be done by an appropriate delegation of some sort. So that's prescriptive in a way, yet it remains quite, there's a level of ambiguity or subjectivity or even vagueness there. By an appropriate delegation, what does that mean at any given point in time? Those things are left open, but it's something that needs to be justified as we progress this. So, for example, decision-making, when in my context of going into institutions and a lot of changing cultural institutions, a lot of changing this process, something provocative to consider in the terms of governance is, can I access that special collection? Sure. You need a letter from community. What does that mean? You need a letter from community. Like, that's hard to be told that as a black fella and you're from that community. What does that mean? Like, who do you, as if you go home and there's this, as if there's no impact of colonisation and there's this fully fledged political entity that just is churning out all of this information and you can just go and plug into it. It's ridiculous. And that's an opinion. So either way, governance in all forms, it plays a crucial role in shaping how power is exercised, how decisions are made, how policies are implemented, and therefore it's a foundational... I don't have to go into this too depth with this. You've got the importance of good governance. I just want to elaborate on this and I want to break it into some different roles. Who's who, what's happening. So there's an incredibly relational nature around this, and it's built upon the understanding of three distinct roles within data governance. I think this provides a great visualisation of ownership, custodianship and stewardship through a triadic network known as the OCS model. Now, the role of the data owner is to determine all purposes for which and means by which a data asset is generated, stored, accessed, processed, and ultimately destroyed. The role of the data custodian is to supply data storage and access services, and the role of the data steward is to supply data processing services, which includes creation, linkage, modelling, analysis, and destruction. The relationship between the data owner and the data custodian determines the custodianship, whilst the relationship between the data owner and the data steward ultimately determines stewardship. So you can see they both link back to the data owner. The data custodian supplies custodianship services for the data owner, and they supply data stewardship. The data steward, they supply them with access and storage services. The data steward provides stewardship services for the data owner, and they provide processing services for a data custodian. So therein are the various relationships, and that's something that you have to take a while to process, because when you read it out, it's like, there's too many working parts. If there were two relationships, it'd be easy, but the third part adds a layer of complexity there. Not overly complex though, but it's important really to distinguish those three roles. So this is a challenge though, because the visualisation of this model, it's critical for operationalising data governance, who's who and who's doing what. However, the articulation of the data roles and responsibilities, they're not always immediately able to be distinguished in the context of Indigenous data. And I'll give you an example of this, particularly the implications upon the governance of Indigenous data assets, whereby in many cases you've got Australian federal and state and territory governments who presume all three roles of data owner, custodian and steward. So an example I'll give in terms of language data or cultural data in institutions is the characterisation of Indigenous data assets as archival records, which postures contemporary government departments and agencies, postures them with this practical authority associated with the role of data owner from those historical actors. All the while, these are the present day government departments and agencies that have replaced those responsible for those past injustices against Indigenous peoples, whilst at the same time avoiding any other negative associations of those actors. So there's an example of how we can conceptually lay this out nice and clearly, but given the circumstances of Indigenous data over time, you can see, I hope you can see fairly clearly how this can be quite tricky. So what I'm going to do, I'm mindful of time and we've got some care and fair stuff. What I would like to do is we're going to go to our panel, and then we may perhaps we will go back to the care and fair stuff after afternoon tea. So could I ask the tech people up the back, are they able to find the next title slide for our panellists? And then I'll introduce us all. It is slide 73, if that helps. So what I'm going to do is I'll introduce our panel members, if they can come and join us. I'll just introduce them by name, and we'll take a moment to do a proper introduction once they're all up. So the first person I'd like to introduce is Michael Aird, who is from the UQ Anthropology Museum. Thank you for being here. Probably from there down, yeah. The second person is Alana Harris, who is joining us from AIATSIS. Please make her welcome. We've got Levi Murray from University of Melbourne and the IIRC. Looking very dapper. And last but not least, we've got Jenny Fewster joining us from the ARDC. Just give us a moment to warm up. So, look, we're going to have a bit of a discussion. Oh, you got to make sure this is close to your mouth, like that, so you're nice and loud, and not too shame. Now, I'm going to just put some of this up. I'm going to get you the Slido. Have a look at this one. Everyone scan your Slido card so you've got that. Give you all a moment. I'm just getting my notes, by the way, because they're on my computer but not on here. Here we are. Good. Okay, so I'm going to change some things around as we go, but let us just start by taking a quick introduction. Could you all please go? Don't be stressed or shamed, Job. We'll do a casual one. Just take the 30 seconds or so or more, not 5 minutes. Yeah, that's 30 seconds. Just to introduce yourself. Where you come from, maybe, you know, what your role is and how you maybe fit into some of this Indigenous data stuff. Who'd like to go first? Thank you.
My name is McLellan. I'm the director of the Anthropology at the University of Queensland. I've been working in the area of Aboriginal history and culture since 1985. And my main interest has been in sort of Queensland Aboriginal photographs. So looking at the storage methods, finding, researching collections all around the world, and trying to work with those photos to interpret Aboriginal history.
Thank you.
I'm Alana Harris. I'm a very proud Ngunnawal Wiradjuri woman from ACT New South Wales. I work at AIATSIS. We had our 60th birthday last year and I've worked there for 40 years. So I've been in a few different... so I've had a few different hats there, but at the moment I'm sort of leading cultural support, coordination around looking after our material in the collection area.
Thank you.
Hi everyone, I'm Jenny Fewster. I work for the Australian Research Data Commons. I'm the Director of the Humanities, Arts, Social Sciences and Indigenous Research Data Commons. I've been with the ARDC since 2021, so since the very beginning of the Hassan Indigenous RDC, and have learnt an awful lot from these two fine young gentlemen to my left about Indigenous data governance. It's been a learning curve. I think it's been a learning curve for all of us, really, in this space, and I think we're all on a journey in relation to Indigenous data governance and sovereignty, and it's a changeable space. I live and work on Kaurna country.
It's a hard act to follow. Levi, Indigenous Data Network, same as Jenny. I've been attached to the Research Data Commons for the exact same period of time, since its conception and since its establishment. Before that, largely education and health, past 20 years. But, you know, by comparison, I've still got some eggshells on my butt, sitting next to some terrific panellists. So I'll chuck it over to Robert.
And I'll just do a quick introduction. I think we've kind of talked a little bit there, but yeah, look, I'm, what am I going to say? Yeah, been embarking on this Indigenous data governance work for a few years now, particularly with the University of Queensland and LDACA. Prior to that, always, all of my roles thus far have been all oriented in around ways of actualising self-determination for Indigenous peoples and communities in one way or another. My country is around Bundaberg, Gladstone, around that region there too. So it is really deadly to have these panel members up here. And as I said, we're going to have a comfortable yarn and a bit of a relaxed conversation that will take us to afternoon tea. So please feel free to have a bit of fun. Don't take it too seriously. I'll try to not take it too seriously either. I hope everyone's got that QR code for Slido, because I am going to change the PowerPoint around. I might change it back, but I will change some different things as we go. But I'm going to start off with a really nice, light, a very easy question for you all, and that's just an open one. We're talking about all this data, all this Indigenous data. Well, I want to know, how much data is there in Australia about Indigenous people, and where is it? Just an easy one to get us going.
I can't tell you how much there is, but I can tell you that it's everywhere. It's in government, it's in private sector, it's in public sector, it's in universities, it's in GLAM, it's in private collections. So it's everywhere, and it's in country.
Can I ask you, Jenny, then?
Yeah.
Since you're starting this one. When you go around and you say it's here, it's there, it's everywhere, where you go to certain institutions or departments or the rest of it, and you say there is Indigenous data here, how is that received?
Is that for me?
That's for you.
Oh, that varies, Robert. Some people are very open to the fact that their data holds Indigenous information, and some people are still coming to terms with that, I would say.
I'm just thinking about what happens in the event that, what happens with that data and and the Indigenous knowledges that is captured in that data, if it's not accessible or it's not well known to those communities, or it's sort of just stored away. Like it always comes back to me. I think about two things. Well, it's either is that useful for mob? Does that help us, or does that not help us? Does that kind of make sense? Because often we couple this with this talk. We talk about the accessibility thing, try and access cultural things. We go, well, if we can't access it, we got some of those old people who might even remember that anthropologists who come through at this time, and if there's still trouble around accessing that, time goes on. Those old people die. Those ones who have some of that knowledge, those things, natural things, that they happen. That doesn't help mob when we've got that stuff locked down. So similar to that idea, I wondered the implication for mob for those, I guess it's mostly non-Indigenous in some of these departments and areas. If they don't recognise that Indigenous data, that they're responsible for Indigenous data assets, I'm just thinking about the magnitude of, the impact that might make on those communities. I know I'm preaching to the converted here, but I wonder if you had if you would like to elaborate.
If I would like to elaborate. He's put me in the hot seat, hasn't he? No, I agree with you that I think one thing that some of you may have heard Robert and I talk about is being carefully fair. And I think that if we don't make these data assets findable, accessible and reusable, and in some cases interoperable for Indigenous communities, then that is a problem, indeed. And so we do need to apply care, so making things available for collective benefit and in a responsible and ethical way, so that Indigenous communities can reach a point of being able to use those and access those data. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, no, I think that's good. I just wanted you to just throwing the thoughts out there. And I think this is a great conversation that starts to stimulate that Slido, and I'm seeing that start to blow up. Before I jump to the Slido though, does anyone have anything they want to add to that ridiculously high level question around the petabytes of data that are out there and where they all are? And
I think I agree with Jenny, Indigenous data is everywhere, but there is an issue with institutions, in a sense, the fear of Aboriginal data being harder to find than other data.
And do you think that's fear from the organisation that holds the data, that they don't want to do the wrong thing and they don't want to expose secret, sacred data, so they just don't expose any of it? Do you think that is it based in fear, do you think?
Well, it is a lot of, particularly, Indigenous people's relations with government bodies in the past. A lot of it was, based on unfair sort of relationships where people were treated differently, treated racially, people treated like scientific subjects, particularly from a sort of police type, reporting type thing where horrible things were said about Aboriginal people, accusations were made that may not be true. Yet people categorised in a certain way with very racist terms. Yes, it may be hard for Aboriginal families to see those words, but also on the other hand, should those words be hidden from Aboriginal people, purely because someone might get offended?
Yeah, and I think out of the context of that, Michael, and very much to that point, there's a conversation a couple of years ago, and it was a literary discussion, and it was looking at Huckleberry Finn, that piece of work, and talking about removing the terms nigger and things like that out of there. That word obviously is horrible within its context, horrible within the connotation still today, and it depends on how it's weaponised or utilised. But in a historical context, one of the things is too, if we start to censor, we start to split, if we start to segregate, what is our role in being accurate historians in the way that we actually, manage that? We can't distort reality and, the things that have occurred. We've also got, a very heavy responsibility, regardless of how uncomfortable or, weird the terminology is. It is a point-in-time reflection of things as they were, as best as we can describe them. So we run a great injustice when we start to splinter and separate that by categorisation after the fact.
I think I remember Marcia Langton saying in one of our meetings in Melbourne, she said, "We are not children, we can handle the data."
Absolutely. And then I made a point before you joined along today, Michael. I was saying, these things, and particularly to like non-Indigenous participants, it's okay, feel that, feel heavy, feel awkward, feel clunky and cumbersome in, wanting to work earnestly and honest towards these issues, these challenges, but also you don't need to walk around with the heaviness the whole time. Pick it up, assess it, work on it in that time, in that space, put it down, come back, revisit it. It's not going to be an overnight fix. It's not an overnight solution. Progress is slow, but you need to be committed to it for the long haul.
Thank you. I want to remind our audience that apparently I've just worked this out on the fly. On this Slido thing, you can upvote or you can like a comment and it puts it at the top. So that's a way to prioritise the most important questions that I might share from you all out there. Does anyone have an example? And, we're looking at different types of data in time, stuff that's already been collected versus stuff that we can rule a line in the sand and we can do Indigenous data governance good and do things better with the future data that we start to collect, or the contemporary data that we start to collect as consequence of the projects that we do. So I'm thinking about this idea of, we're talking about, what's collected about us without us, that nothing about us without us kind of thing. And also to that, well, we're mature enough, we have a right to make a decision. We don't need non-Indigenous institutions telling communities what they can handle and what they can't handle, that kind of thing. So I'm articulating my thoughts out loud as we go, with not a direct question, but I'm thinking about those things. And particularly the question is around, I guess, what do we do in terms of dealing with some of those issues right now? And how do we move away from that, particularly data collected about us without us, in the context of new data, but in the context of that old stuff too. You know? Does anyone have any thoughts on that? Is that clear, or have I just been a bit jumbled?
I think we've got a great opportunity moving forward in the way that we go about collecting data. And I think that bringing in Indigenous data governance frameworks helps immensely. I think that retrospectively things are much more difficult in terms of dealing with data that's already been collected, like Levi's dad's blood sample. You know, things that's a harder nut to crack, I think, how we deal with this retrospectively. And I think also government agency data is probably the most difficult. Especially if you want to reach that kind of ideal of sovereignty. I think that's almost impossible, really, frankly.
So do you have any thoughts on then, anyone, in terms of the emerging frameworks around Indigenous data governance and the focus on that? And now's the time when we're starting to do a lot more training in that aspect, and particularly building the competencies around that with the governance tools that we use. And we're going to spend a whole session on this after afternoon tea. Do you suspect that it may be a case of, you know, over time where we build that competency up around Indigenous data governance, and you might instantly, you know, in the first instance engage with new data around that? Do you think that overall competency that gets built up will then therefore inform or give greater confidence to institutions to deal with that old data? I'll talk about that white fragility kind of idea around locking data down. Do you think that, do you foresee that greater competency around the Indigenous data governance skills will provide a space for more rigorous processes for getting communities in and making decisions about that old data, that contentious data?
I might start on that. So AIATSIS now, we have very sort of set processes about acquisition and registration of new material coming in. When AIATSIS first started, we were just keen to get anything. So they were just sort of accepting material, and of course that means a lot of the time we had no information about it. So with the new processes that are in place, material generally doesn't get past the front door unless there's a lot of work done with whoever's donating or depositing about the ISIP owners of the material. And so there's a lot of work if they don't know, because a lot of the time they don't, because it may be their father's material or grandfather's material. There's a lot of work done to work that out before it comes into the collection. So, you know, like in the last few years we've been doing that, and moving forward that's really helpful. But, you know, we've got thousands and thousands and thousands of items that have been collected over the years. And so that's why we come to things like this, you know, to talk to people, you know, get out in community, get people into AIATSIS to help with, you know, getting you know, names on paper, you know, all the information that we need to make that material available, particularly for community.
I think the basic, you know, principle of any collecting institution is, you know, an object, a document, a photograph, an artefact. It comes into the collection, essentially it sits on a shelf and potentially, hopefully still there in 100 or 200 years' time. But in that 100 years, it takes time and it takes effort and time to treat it, you know, to put a number on it, to store it properly, to make it accessible to, you know, essentially at the good end of things, you know, hopefully say on an online database, so anybody anywhere in the world can find that object is sitting in an institution. So again, it's a lot of work, and a lot of institutions, particularly in the still to this day, but particularly in the past, so many objects have literally sat on a shelf for 100 years without a number on it. Then someone finds it 100 years later, and as Alana alluding to, haven't got a clue where it's come from, who donated it, who made it, what community it's associated with. Our collection at the Anthropology Museum at UQ is very much stuck with that, for many of their objects. We know that they were donated in 1949 by the founder of our museum, or came in the next 10 years after that, without any information at all attached to them, other than the person who donated them. So that's the type of thing every institution lives with. And again, this raises the issue. If Aboriginal communities can't access that data, can't access those objects or documents, then the possibility of having information attached is potentially lost.
And I think, to that effect too, though, given both Alana and Michael's expertise, they really highlight and illustrate such a key point we probably haven't nearly drilled down on nearly enough today. And we talk about having subject matter expertise and involving community members in there, but the golden thread across all of those things is skill, right? The work is not only labour intensive, it's not only time intensive, it is skill intensive. And so, what we do have is a significant shortage of not just subject matter expertise, but the actual skill to sit in these environments and, to work through and have really critical discernment and to be, really sensible is probably the other word that we don't use nearly enough, right? To be level-headed and to be sensible in these spaces is of the utmost importance. But yeah, skill is a big thing. And I sit with the idea, and whenever we're asked, what is it that we think we need? Yes, we're always going to need money. We're always going to need resourcing. We're always going to need all of these things. But over the top, a lot of this comes back down to human endeavour, and comes back down to goodwill. Collegial effort, people having shared value in this. It's not just beneficial for mob. When we curate, when we are accurate historians, when we manage data effectively and with purpose, and when we do that for global benefit, when we make things discoverable as need be, and accessible as need be, it benefits everyone, right? There is not a single person in here that does not benefit from that. And, the benefit might not be immediate, it might not, make full sense straight away, but yeah, I will argue that until I'm a thin little old white man, which will be a while. So happy to have that and die on that hill. Yeah.
So I'm just going through the Slido, and there is actually some really good questions, but there's a lot of questions I'm going to hold on to because I think you just need to come back after afternoon tea. That is, a lot of it is just it's wanting the prescriptive stuff. We're going to do that after afternoon tea. So and they're getting a lot of upvotes, so don't think I'm being obstinate in just trying to not look at them. I'm seeing them. But I'm just going to pick some other ones, and we're at 3:30, but yeah, let's keep this going just for a few more minutes, I think, because it's good conversation. One of these ones, I think, how to balance engaging with mob about AD-GOV without them taking the burden of doing all the work. So how to translate that in an organisational into an organisational standard. So has anyone got some thoughts on that? We know what it's like. We know that feeling. Are you shaking your head there, Jenny? We've taken Jenny under our wing as our non-Indigenous friend. We're claiming her. So she's had the fights with us. She's been a good. I don't want to say the allyship word, but she's there. She's been around with it. So I guess, yes, you do know the feeling because you see Levi, myself and others, you see our burnout. And you feel that.
Yeah.
So does anyone have some thoughts on that, around effectively managing that, some of the tips around it, or some of the things to consider? Because it's still a thing.
It is just about good systems, and particularly when Indigenous people have information to contribute, to make sure that is captured, which quite often can be overlooked.
One of the things I'll add is particularly around resourcing and the different types of projects. And you know, there's a great privilege in being able to say, oh, well, we must consider building a budget that has adequate resourcing for, you know, a sufficient amount of Indigenous staff to build up a little team of their own, to support one another, to manage that workload and a workflow of its own. There's a great privilege in saying that, ruling a line in the sand and saying this is how we can do it and make provisions for that, because often a lot of these projects we know are running on the smell of an oily rag, yeah? But for those who do have adequate resourcing and don't make those sufficient provisions, yet want to work with Indigenous data governance, to do anything short of that would be, I'd say, shameful, right? And grossly irresponsible. So that's one of the obvious, glaringly obvious ones I'll share is that appropriate resourcing. Any other comments?
Time to participate. Like, genuinely, time to participate. You'd probably, you know, you could be knocked over with a feather the amount of times that people want to consult and it's days before they submit or publish something. Or, you know, we've got this and then it's like, oh yeah, we're going to operationalise this and okay, when's the rollout? It's next week. Awesome. So guess who doesn't sleep for the next couple of days? Time, right? Be considerate. Like, that's not an exceptional request or a consideration. It's just like, if you're going to do something, right from the outset, just be like, oh, okay, what kind of time might be required or needed in actually wanting to progress this work? What does that look like? And have a realistic and, you know, you need to kind of exercise critical reflexivity here, right? And say, well, what are the current relationships that we have with people in communities? If any, do they exist? Are they well maintained? Are we well respected? Do we communicate well? You know, and if they're not, the more runtime you're then going to need to kind of put into your thinking in your planning, right? You can't just, and it's to the point of resourcing time, you can't drop on another request on hyper-extended services, under-resourced areas. And my other comment to that, just another one just to tap in, we need people to be sledgehammers too. We need people to be okay and not be awkward. Like, you know, it's great that, you know, we've got the likes, you know, I work with Marcia Langton. Marcia is formidable. Marcia's not always going to be here. And then what? We wait for the next Marcia Langton? Well, no, it's also everyone else. There are non-Indigenous counterparts and people who can absolutely be sledgehammering as much as what Marcia is, and all of these other people, you know, who have contributed tirelessly for a very long time. Do some sledgehammering once in a while and let us just go in there with a couple of small pickaxes. Oh my gosh, that would be so beneficial.
And you know, there's a bit of this dichotomy at play between seeing it for what it is, seeing the poor excuse of engagement, the last minute at the 11th hour kind of thing. There's a real dichotomy between saying, no, that's not good enough, and that's not how we work, and you need to do better, versus, well, if we don't bend over backwards, and if we don't stay up late, and if we don't contribute feedback, and if we don't go over and beyond for this, blackfella voices are not represented once again, and the time rolls on. So what happens? The 9 to 5 job finishes, but mob are working midnight on it to do that. You know, that's a real challenge. We've seen it. We know what good consultation might look like or should look like, and it's not, don't rock up to a community with something ready to go that you just want endorsed or ratified. You know?
And you know, consultations on the buzzword bingo card, right? Swap consultation for good, effective communication. To communicate, right? With clarity, with purpose, with intent. It's just like consultation, what that actually is and what that actually translates to is, you know, being asked a bunch of questions and, you know, being exhausted this death by extraction process. So, you know, communicate. It's a two-way thing.
And the two bits on that is, don't go with something that's locked down and solid and decisions have already made and we just need you to nod your head, please. Why aren't you nodding your head? Right, well, move you on, get another black fella in until that one nods his head, right? Tick the box, done. Or there was one hurdle, we got through that. There's a difference between that, yeah. So it's not about going in with material that is so defined and complete and at the end stage of it, but equally it's not going there with a blank page either and expecting mob to just know exactly what and design that. It's being that good having good communication. It's going in there. It's doing part of the heavy lifting already to present something, to communicate with purpose and clear intent, and that takes work first to show that whatever group you're engaging with at any given time, that you're actually committed to that, you're authentic, genuine about it, yeah?
Yeah. I do think of one of my favourite quotes from Marcia, and there's so many. There's so many. But my favourite quote, and she says it all the time, is don't rock up like a lazy undergrad student that hasn't done their homework. It's nice, it's clean, that speaks to everyone. Don't rock up, do your homework. If you're going to be in that, like, you know, be earnest, be deliberate, rock up, put some effort in. Shared distribution of effort and workload as well.
So we've got 5 minutes left because I just gave you 15 minutes more, and which means that you don't get an afternoon tea break. No, again, no. I'll get
I would
flogged.
actually fight you if I didn't eat this afternoon.
But I do want to sort of bring it to a close with this last question because it is the most popular one. It is trending on Slido. Hashtag. I guess this question, it's specific, but there is a general sort of balance here that we can talk to too. So the question is around how do you combine the notion that data governance should be disaggregated, the notion that data itself should be disaggregated and available at the individual level on the one hand. How do you balance that with the right to privacy on the other hand? So I mean, I guess yes, we're talking about being disaggregated and available, but generally speaking, we're talking about that responsible and those ethical considerations around open access and responsible I won't say that yet. Yeah, open access and doing that responsibly.
Read the question again.
How do you combine the notion that what I'm saying is as open as possible, as closed as necessary. I think that's what this question is saying, yeah? How do you combine the notion that data should be disaggregated and available at the individual level on the one hand with the right to privacy on the other hand?
Well, we at AIATSIS, we've got that problem sort of on a lot of different levels because we also have to factor in copyright, sacred, men's, women's, all of those things. So one of my jobs at the moment is, so just what Levi was saying about people having skills and things. So we're struggling to get archivists, and you know there's a real shortage around that, you know, those jobs. But when we do get people, they're generally not mob. So AIATSIS has got, I think it's about 33% Indigenous staff at the moment, and so we have the issue of we have non-Indigenous staff who are technically very good, but are too scared to make a decision because they don't know who to talk to, where to go, you know, haven't done Aboriginal studies. And so that puts a lot of pressure on the 33% staff that we do have, even if it's not their job. Or the other thing, you know, no fault of their own. We've got the stolen generation, we've got people that are learning about their culture and you know, being accepted by the, you know, communities that their family were removed from. And then, you know, they're seen as Indigenous people, as they should be, but they don't have the background to be able to bring that information into their job. And so then we have, them having difficulties making decisions, or being able to say to someone, no, I can't answer that. So one of my jobs at the moment is to try and build up a bit of cultural strength, I guess, amongst everybody, because we're all in it together. And so we do try not to do, there's this group of Aboriginal staff here, get them to do this or ask their opinion about these things, while the rest of the staff, go on their merry way. So we try and balance all that out. Obviously, there are some people that are better at engaging with our key stakeholders and community and things, and so you rely on those people to be able to do that, but you've got to take other people along on the drive with you to learn how to do that.
That's deadly. And I just want to say, I asked Alana to join this panel, and she said to me, "No, she's too shame." I think you're representing AIATSIS really well.
Oh, thank you. And I have to say, if I had known I was on the panel, I would have dressed up.
Hey, I dressed down too. Look, I'm going to move to close this panel. And the way I want to close it is I'm going to do this little provocation for you, and it's probably a 10-second thing for each of you. So it's going to be speed thinking. Don't think too much about it. Don't get stressed about it. Look, give you the magic wand. In a perfect world, you've got this magic world. What are you going to fix? We're talking about Indigenous data governance and the challenges that arise. You all come from different areas, slightly different. You've got different, outlooks on this. For you, you got that magic wand. What are you going to fix? So I'm looking for a 10-second, elevator pitch that says, right, in a perfect world, boom, boom, boom. That's what it's about.
Hyper-investment to skill and skill acquisition for anyone, including or specifically Indigenous peoples, regardless of where they're geographically positioned. So learning on country or learning in a city or in a town, being able to upskill and being able to contribute in this space. And skill acquisition for non-Indigenous staff as well. If I could have that, that would be my wish.
Good.
I reckon I would fix entrenched and unrecognised whiteness in Australian data policy.
Oh. 10 seconds, but did you want to elaborate on that? Or we'll keep rolling.
How long have I got? No, we'll keep going.
My 10 seconds, ditto to those two, and more time with community people so that they're getting their 50% worth.
Deadly.
Yeah.
I think for me it's just a huge improvement of every cultural institution in the world having online databases so that everybody, can access data.
Hey.
What about you, Rob?
Oh, God, I was... My brain was thinking. I don't have a 10-second one. Look, for me, we've got a few different focuses, but I think, honestly, it's around a contribution to building a secure and thriving Indigenous data ecosystem and everything that's involved in that. I'm going to tell you more about that after afternoon tea. We're going to talk about what that ecosystem looks like beyond the data commons and what that looks like. But before we go to that, Michael, Alana, Jenny, Levi, what a deadly panel. Please give them a big round of applause once more. You fellas, I could yarn with you all day. We're going to take a short 15 as opposed to a long 15, and we're going to come back just after 4 o'clock. So please enjoy your afternoon tea. Okay, welcome back. This is the home stretch, and dawning on me how we could actually spend a full week of this masterclass to properly go through and break it down. I think if only it gives you a bit of a taste of things to come. Now, what we're going to introduce to you this afternoon is the Governance of Indigenous Data Framework, which is to be published very, very shortly. Now, this framework has been developed for the Hass and I Research Data Commons, but it's something that we will make publicly available purely for the benefit of guiding everyone else through the actualisation and the implementation of Indigenous data governance within your respective areas of work. So you'll see different icons, the iconography used throughout the framework in the print, actually on the slides today, has been done by Gooreng artist Dylan Sara, and so I want to acknowledge that also. Alongside all of these icons, there are specific symbols and reasons as to why we do that, and the symbols link directly with the key tenets of the framework. So I won't spend time on that today because we're going to get straight into it, and then we're going to break you up into some sections, and we're going to have a bit of a run around the room with the microphone again, and get some conversations and see how this might apply to you. Now, we have got less than an hour, so we're going to do the abridged version, but we're still going to jump into it. So I'm going to bring up Levi. You're going to kick us off. Hey? You got notes? Or? You got notes?
So the framework, as Robert mentioned, and I alluded to this earlier throughout the day, in talking about the genesis of this, and looking at a national effort of work towards Indigenous data governance and the governance of Indigenous data. This work specifically was brought about by National Indigenous Australia's agency. There was a pretty good percentage of the crowd earlier this morning that were, aware of this and really kind of perceptive to it, and maybe have read through some of it, and looked at, the approach, the method, and really kind of started to say, okay, what does that mean for us, particularly if you're an APS servant and, working within that sector. But also, you might have had a sticky beak, as we've, noticed Indigenous data governance and sovereignty has expanded, and the discourse has kind of breached every other corner and every other domain, particularly where as far as data and data management and custodianship is concerned. For those who haven't, highly recommend having a read through it. It's a short, uncomplicated document to read and interpret. If you have struggled to interpret it, let's have a conversation. But that is largely the genesis of it, and that body of work was also predicated underneath the National Closing the Gap Agreement, those priority reforms that I had mentioned as well. So one of the things that it aims to do, amongst multiple, but the primary one is really about empowering Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people here within the context of Australia to be able to have more input, more control, and greater discernment about how data is governed, particularly within public departments and the APS sector. So the framework in which we designed and developed, we knew that the public sector were developing a framework. That is partially due to the fact that I was one of the co-contributors in the design in that body of work, working alongside National Indigenous Australia's agency. Knowing that, and knowing that the Improving Indigenous Research Capabilities project sits within the Hass and I, right from the beginning of that conversation and that work, once Naya had commenced that, I'd started having conversations with the director of Hass and I, Jenny Fewster, and saying that, we need to collegially put the efforts and make sure that national efforts around Indigenous data governance, particularly if we're to have success, and if it's to actually transform from philosophy and, abstract ideas, aspirations, and, out of the realms of ideology, and have actual impact, then what we know is that, a lot of frameworks historically, or a lot of pieces of work have often been done in silo. And so Jenny, as the visionary she is, agreed to it and absolutely said, go for gold, go for broke. And so as a result, one of the key things that we'd also done each year is we convene a symposium for the Hasandai. And yeah, one of the key activities that we focused on was the development of a framework to unify our approaches underneath the Research Data Commons, but also systematically align some of those core principles, some of the emergent key themes, and some of the ideals from the other current framework. What's the benefit of that? It makes it very, very difficult if everyone starts to sing the same tune. It makes it very, very difficult not to support the work at a state level or at a national level or an international level if all of a sudden all the frameworks and stuff start to actually make sense and they start to have some sort of commonality across them all. So therein lies the premise and the genesis of that. This particular part though, and one of the things that's really poignant underneath all of this, for those who aren't familiar, and there's a few of you this morning, around the Closing the Gap priority reforms and reform areas, those 4 priority areas. The National Closing the Gap strategy had a review, and that was at the beginning of last year. And of there is this particular comment and this particular quote. And you will have heard me talk about this throughout the day. But one of the things is, we talk about the very nature and the complexity of Indigenous data or data and data management. One of the things that in this report, when they went through and assessed, the aspirations, the alignments, the progression around this work, and what the government had agreed to underneath the Closing the Gap agreement, is that they hadn't quite realised how much work and how much actual investment and resourcing and time and all of those things were actually going to be needed, to invest it in this body of work to actually bring it to fruition. And it's just a really good point to kind of focus on, because, part of why today has been, in some sense, a little bit philosophical, and it seems like it's gone off in tangential, is because also it is. If it all feels a little bit like wishy-washy in some parts, it's also because it is, until we solidify that and we can translate it. But for the most part, when we do have tangible things and when we can build stuff and we've got good goodwill and collegiality, we bunker down and we grab the tangible and we bring those forward first, right? And everything else can follow.
Hello, 1, 2. Oh, there we go. Good. All right. I'll sit down because I'm comfortable. You sit down too if you want, but
I'll stand because I'm comfortable.
All right. So I'm going to run you through the governance model. This is a fairly comprehensive document, actually, and as I said before, it will be published very shortly. So pick that up. But one of the key parts, of course, is at the centre of it is the governance model, and the governance model presents the basis upon which the 4 key guidelines are formed, and this includes, as you can see, representation, capabilities, self-determination, and the Indigenous data ecosystem. Now, representation is reflected by the native bee, which you'll see in the top corner. Capabilities is reflected by the canoe in the bottom. Self-determination by the constellation, which is the metaphor I used at the start in opening up today's presentation. And the last one is the spider web, which represents the Indigenous data ecosystem. Now, the important part about that, you'll see it's not off to the side, it's at the centre. So when you read this document and become familiar with it, you'll see there's a great importance on fostering, building, nurturing, extending on an Indigenous data ecosystem locally, as far as so-called Australia is concerned. So everything that you are actively engaged in as Indigenous data practitioners, for one word or another, a very important focus on that too. So beyond the guidelines, we've got two things that we're looking at. We're looking at guidelines, we're looking at practice. So beyond the guidelines, there are further governance practices which are detailed for reform and implementation of Indigenous data governance. So we're getting quite descriptive at this level, which is all around strengthening a competent, capable and responsive Indigenous data ecosystem, which is central to the model. So each of those four aspects, I'm going to go through them with you now. They break into guidelines, which some of them, there might be about 10, there might be 12 guidelines for each different, I've mixed the words up. Guidelines, practices. Guidelines, practices. There are 4 guidelines, and in every guideline, there is about 10 or more, 10 to 12 specific practices. We're getting late in the day. Can you jump to the next one? I'll look at this one. So this is guideline number 1. Now this one talks about establishing formal partnerships and sharing decision making with Indigenous Australians at all stages of the data life cycle to ensure their priorities are reflected in the data affecting them. Now this should come at no surprise to you if you've just sat in the whole day and you've listened to some of the things that we're talking about. I hope this is sort of like the culmination of a lot of these ideas coming to be consolidated in what is a framework. So yeah, it's no surprise that's got a high importance around partnering with First Nations people, that being the first guideline that we use. As I said, there's about 10 or more of these, but I'm going to highlight 3 that I think are particularly relevant for today. The goal of this exercise is to go through the essence of these different guidelines, and before we finish, we're going to break into a conversation around the room where you start to think about what's your interpretation of these guidelines and how does that apply to you and your context and where you're working at. So data sharing agreements, which is around negotiating clear and transparent data sharing agreements with Indigenous communities that outline how data will be collected, stored, attributed, analysed and shared, ensuring that Indigenous priorities and concerns are appropriately addressed. One of the other ones is around, I don't know if I said, I'm tired and forgetting. All of these are very closely aligned. They cover off on all of those care principles, and they link directly to specific FAIR principles also. So there is an alignment which we have spent time on. Myself and Jenny Fewster particularly have been running around spreading the good word about careful fairness as far as we can and trying to encourage people in that body of work. And this fits so nicely into this one. So policy advocacy, advocating for policies and legislation that recognises and respects Indigenous data rights and sovereignty and promotes meaningful and empowered Indigenous participation in data governance processes. I'm aware I'm reading to you off the PowerPoint, which is a no-go, but I want you to sit with this and start to think about how this reflects in your own circumstance.
Can I just dovetail in? One of the reasons why when you look at the actual framework, once you're granted the opportunity and it's published, is to really kind of look at those practices. The reason why there are so many examples in there and so many practices outlined is, I'll give you another example. When we think of reconciliation action plans, right, and the mechanism which they were supposed to provide and how it is that, you know, we bring forth all of these things around that body of work. One of the challenges is that, you know, once organisations, institutes, schools, etc., agreed to, you know, proceed with the reconciliation action plan, actually determining the practices and actually outlining some key activities in the first instance has always been a challenge. It's one of the reasons why a reconciliation action plan, more often than not, gets kicked down the road like a can and remains unempty or unachieved or, you know, unobtained. And, you know, they set out at a period of time, you know, whatever the duration that they propose in their first reconciliation action plan, there's always a bunch of actions left over for the next iteration and then the one that follows, so on, so on. So what we wanted to do and what we wanted to be very clear and very purposeful is to be able to say to all of our partners within the Research Data Commons is, look, there's a couple of key things here, but also this is stimulus to actually, be critical, self-reflecting, and actually examine, in earnest, how it is that you guys actually, meet some of these things. How are they actually aligned? And it's not for the value of that and having that conversation back to us in these projects and this work. It's actually to do that and communicate backwards. As a national infrastructure, you can bet your butt we're going to get a whole bunch of questions about how it is that we govern, how it is that we manage Indigenous data, how do we do that effectively, and where's the evidence more critically, right? And so what we want to do, and like I said, we've got such great energy, such great commitment across the Research Data Commons that we said, here's a head start. These are what these guidelines look like. These are some of those practices, but also we want you guys to be really imaginative and expand out on that. You could have 30 practices in there. This framework is to take and to adopt and build out for what it is that you need it to be.
No, that's good. No, thank you. The final one on this one is around recognition of the diversity of community, recognising that appropriate community consultation will differ according to data and community involved and may require discussions with diverse groups at an individual, local or wider level, or to put in another way, not all the same or belonging to one, despite the homogenous term Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander, yeah? Okay, so look at guideline 2, which is around, this one's about improving the data-related capabilities of data practitioners and Indigenous communities to generate an increased sense of agency and confidence to engage within data-related management and decision-making processes throughout all stages of the data life cycle. This is our ability to respond, right? They're all important, right? Okay, so this one looks at the recognition of traditional and Indigenous knowledge, recognising and valuing traditional Indigenous knowledge systems and practices related to data collection, management and interpretation, and integrating this knowledge into data-related training and capability efforts. We also considered tailor resources, developing and disseminating educational resources, guides and toolkits specifically designed for Indigenous Australians, taking into account cultural sensitivities and diverse learning styles. Also too, the other one I'm sharing is access to technology, providing and advocating for access to technology and software tools necessary for creating and working with data such as computers, internet access, data analysis software, geographic information systems software, and data capture devices. These are very real, very real concerns, even just getting Wi-Fi and solid internet out at these different places to build upon that. One of the things I always think of just quickly is that the bit of technology called the Raspberry Pi, for those who are familiar with it or not, but you can, it's a very effective, cost-effective piece of technology about that big, which you can put data on, take it out to various communities, and it can emit signal, and you can connect to that as its own little miniature server and access that information wherever you are. So, little things like that. All right, our next one, we're looking at number 3, which is around self-determination, a pretty big one. Supporting the self-determination of Indigenous peoples when engaging with data throughout all stages of the data life cycle, developing straightforward methods for Indigenous peoples to know what data are held relating to their interests, how it can be accessed, and providing increased usability and analytical skills. And the 3 examples that we've got there. Metadata enrichment. Oh, I could talk on and on and on and on and on about this one. It's incredibly important. So we're talking about metadata enrichment. I don't need to describe that to you. You can read that there. Extremely important, and something that we've got a big focus on, particularly with LDACA. The other one there is around this idea of data activism and access. Again, harnessing data and technology to drive social and political change begins with appropriate access to data. Access and responsible dissemination throughout Indigenous communities can strengthen topical awareness and, with the appropriate data, opportunities to overcome self-determined political and health challenges. So, yeah, do you want to, got anything to add to that one?
Oh, I've already moved to guideline 4.
Oh, good. Okay, and the last one, data access. Oh, you've skipped it on. Okay. Right, this one's about fostering organisational and cultural change to enhance the inclusion of Indigenous Australians in data governance processes and bodies, setting a positive example. So this is that inclusive data ecosystem that we're talking about. It's inclusive of things like policy development, developing policies and guidelines that explicitly recognise the rights of Indigenous Australians, looking at transparent processes, and also looking at specific systems and services, particularly around the preservation and persistence of data and services, acknowledging that that itself is crucial to building a sustainable and competent ecosystem in the long term. Now, that's just, as I said, that's just a sample of some of those guidelines. I just want to talk briefly to this last slide, which is the implementation matrix that we call. Well, it's called the analysis tool for implementation, and its purpose is to really it's about embedding the governance practices within your own organisational contexts, and the purpose of this is to consider the implementation of the 4 guidelines through the positioning of strategy, risk and mitigation as it applies to the context of your Indigenous data governance work. Now, I want to say very clearly, take photos of this, sure, but do not, absolutely do not, treat this as a box-filling exercise. This is a conceptual diagram. Do not go and fill those boxes out. This is to conceptually frame your way of thinking around how you implement Indigenous data governance. Now, I don't want to send that off with you in the airy-fairy sense. I'll be very clear. This should instruct you to go back into your organisation, into your own context, and develop a plan of some sort, perhaps 30 or more pages, right? Where you can start to navigate your way through this, where you can start to look, what is on scope in terms of representation? What are the things that we're looking at in the immediate interim, in terms of what are we strategically looking at? Consider the risks. Now, we've got up there people, purpose, and data-oriented challenges. Now, I don't know if we touched on this yet with the fair and care stuff, but the analysis work that went on with the care principles, an assessment of all of those data governance principles was done. And as part of that assessment, it was categorised that of all of the frameworks that currently existed, they were either closely aligned with people-oriented, purpose-oriented, or data-oriented. And it's stressed that a lot of the Indigenous data governance frameworks were closely, had a strong highlight on the people and the purpose, right? As well as the data, but the non-Indigenous ones didn't highlight that as much. So that's that Carol et al. Work that you can go and look further on, and that is why it features prominently within the implementation part of it. So is that clear? You start to make your way through that, but it's not a box ticking, it's not a box filling exercise. Don't try and do that, because box 1, you're going to look at internal and external factors as it applies to representation. Well, there's 2 or 3 pages already just looking at what are some of the strategies that you can have on hold. I don't like the... I think an appropriate reference is, as Levi said about the Reconciliation Action Plan, although they're not my favourite, it's a similar kind of... Conceptually, it's very similar, isn't it? It's creating that... It's a strategic document that you can start to look at, again, how are you going to implement this? So there'll be an operational component of that too, yeah?
The distinction or the difference between a Reconciliation Action Plan is that more often than not, they'll employ just one Indigenous person, and I tell you what, that's a lonely job trying to develop out a whole plan for a whole organisation that's got zero maturity, not only is it lonely, it's, you know, more often than not, it's fraught and it's very injurious. So, you know, the distinction or the difference is that governance, everyone has a role in that. Everyone needs to be co-contributing to it. It is not the inherent job of just one person in an identified role, but rather it is the want and the need of, you know, many identified positions and opportunities being created within the environments in which we operate and create, and then everyone participating in that. It's an everybody job. You know, we get there together or we don't get there at all. It's quite simple. It's uncomplicated.
So it is an everybody job, which brings us to this component, and I need our runners with the mic again on standby. Regardless of if you're black, white or brindle, you're all in this room now and you're going to be contributing to your own implementation strategies. Now I think we're going to sort of split you into like a quadrant here. You want to do it that way? We'll just allocate them one? Yes. Yeah, so you mob down the front. You all come from your own organisational contexts, right? But you're going to look at representation, as I've described it to you. You'd be thinking there, sitting there listening, thinking, so what does it mean to you though? What does it mean to your organisational context and the work that you do? Think about that. And I want you to feel comfortable sharing about, you know, sharing perhaps what that means or what perhaps some of the considerations are going to be in terms of keeping that essence. What would you be wanting to implement or in terms of reform? Let's not look at the problems. Let's just look at some of the things that we would like to do. The problems will come when you do this analysis tool and you work through it, and that's a bit more personal to your organisational context. But just in the interest of this room, let's share some of those strategies. So if we do this front corner, you can be representation, yeah? This left-hand corner, my left-hand corner, you fellas can be capabilities. So thinking about capabilities as I've described it to you. Now, as we go to these, and then up the back right-hand corner, you could be self-determination, and the back left-hand corner, you can be the Indigenous data ecosystem. So of this front corner, you're thinking about representation. If we start with you fellas, we could go back to that guideline 1, and that might help get some stimulus on it. Does that sound right? Anyone here want to share some thoughts around what representation is going to mean in the context of Indigenous data, what representation means to you in your organisational context? Yep. And perhaps one thing that you think should be, now that can be a low-hanging fruit, or that can be something more long-term or more difficult, but share some, it could be more aspirational, but perhaps, yeah, can you share something that you think might be, that you'd like to implement? Maybe we should, yeah? Thank you. And your name too as we go, yeah?
Yeah, Daniel Featherstone, RMIT University. So one of the ways that we do this with the project I'm doing on digital inclusion research is we set up collaboration agreements with each of the 12 communities that we're doing the research in. So they're partners in the survey and the delivery of the research, and we train community co-researchers to do that work on the ground. And that way there's both skills development, but there's that ownership. We give all of the data back to them. They use that for their own purposes as well. So it's both that data sharing as well as building capacity at a community level. Yeah. Going forward, we're doing more of that nationally, so we're in the process of starting to identify those partners in other regional areas as well.
Deadly. Thank you. Anyone else from your group want to share? Yep.
It's Ruth from Queensland Health again. I would like that aspirational objective is to implement something that I've seen in New South Wales state government. They've got the data connector service. So there's multiple departments now that are signing up to that, and good or bad, but it seems to be quite unique in that way that it's being that impresario for the person in community who needs data or has a question, and then someone to guide them through the process of getting access to the data. And then ideally that would evolve into the skills and the science to use the data with integrity and keep building that flow.
And so you would see how that kind of strategy then, when you look at that matrix, you'll start to see how that in different forms is going to start to appear in the different sections, and you know, and that's the way it's going to be. You know, it's not isolated. It's and that's totally fine too. Thank you for sharing. We got one more. Yep.
I'll be really, really quick. I'm quite ignorant. I am one of those people, and today has been enlightening. Thank you. I'm Beck Walker, Queensland Health. And I work with legislative change, policy, and I'm actually working on legislating the RHD register. And for me, it really is apparent that our legislation is one of our main barriers. And I think we really need to make our legislation more contemporary, and not only for Indigenous data, but also data sharing across the private sector within government. It is just so difficult, and I know because I work there, and I'm one of those people who say no, confidentiality, you can't have that data. So today has been amazing. Please don't judge me, I'll get better.
Absolutely not. You know, it takes a whole great deal of bravery to sit there and do that. You ain't going to get flogged for that. You ain't going to get flogged for that. But that also needs to be, you know, a lesson, like, for everyone. Like, that, you know, when I said before we need more sledgehammers, that's a sledgehammer moment. Sitting there, being vulnerable enough to say, you know, I actually don't know what I don't know. How good? How good? Not ignorant. It's just like, we all start somewhere. And if that's starting today, great. You know? I always say this thing that I'm 90%, you know, cynical, bitter, jaded and twisted. But the other 10% of me is, you know, deeply starry-eyed and optimistic. So, and it's where all my hope comes from. But yeah, amazing. Like, oh, thank you for that comment.
And there's really no, in this forum, there's no sort of limit in that regard. You know, don't feel ashamed to speak up. But one thing I did pick up of all those three examples was how different they are. Like, you've got a very hands on the ground data sharing agreement, face to face. Like, you've got something that seems on the ground and so connected. Then you're talking about legislative reform, which seems so far away from that. Nevertheless, that same process, that same matrix, you can tick through that strategic thinking process and come to the result that you want to, regardless of where you're positioned. So this is the purpose of this exercise, is to kind of demonstrate and think about how that fits back into that. And for me, that's clear. And I'm testing things always as we go, you know. I don't think for one moment that data governance framework is going to be perfect when we publish it. You know, I think it's going to be version 1, and I'm happy with that. Just want to get version 1 up and going.
I know.
Can you sense where we got a publishing thing we've got to push on with? I'm going to go over here. Yeah? Now, you mob in this corner, you're talking about guideline 2, which is around building data-related capabilities.
Simon Musgrove, Language Data Commons of Australia. I'm a linguist. I've been involved in conversations with Robert around the question of how impenetrable the kind of writing that academics do is. And I'd like to suggest that one part of this guideline is trying to reduce the amount of disciplinary gatekeeping that is done by academics.
I'll ask you the same question, Simon, and that is, would you like to elaborate?
We have to find ways of making the knowledge that we construct through our disciplines accessible to people who haven't spent 10 years training in the discipline.
Yep.
One of the biggest leverages there was that movement from informant to co-author. Yeah? You know what I mean?
You know, that's... oh, gosh. I lose sleep. I lose sleep at night with being lost in translation and, the academic exercise of, linguistic gymnastics. No offence. But it's just like, I consider myself an educated person and enough to, decipher. But who here has done research, right? Who's ever created, published and generated research? Okay, that's a whole heap of people. For that, right, we have this thing in their plain language statements, yeah? What's the value of a plain language statement? Oh, it's to ensure that people actually understand and can participate, and consent to their participation. We use plain, uncomplicated, uncontroversial language to ensure that we are effectively, asking people. Why do we not do that then with all of this, philosophical stuff? There's some of it that requires, good academic rigour and some better words than I would choose. But for the most part, yeah, absolutely. Let's not lock things up in language. Let's make it uncomplicated. And my very first job this morning, Simon, coming in here and to everyone else, was going through those definitions, right? Because you need months and months of time to actually cut through it and understand what that means, how it potentially applies. And even up until this morning, I was sitting there grappling with how do I explain this in a way that can be broad enough for everyone and yet high level enough for people who are further down on this journey as well. So yeah, it's such a great point. I will, yeah. Oh, love it.
Have we got one more capabilities, or have we gone into the next boundary?
I think I'm in capabilities. I'm happy to speak to that. One of the things I'm from the Australian Research Council's Centre for Indigenous and Environmental Histories and Futures. I'm the data manager there, and one of the things that we're finding is that this capability building, and bringing people along genuinely through relationships on that journey through the project, from inception, through co-design gets thrown around a lot, but through authentic co-design, that's the way to break down those barriers, is to build that in. So the project from the start is the projects come from community. They're not driven by researchers. We go to community and we say, here's what we can do. Here's what the skills we have. What do you want to do? And that allows us to identify opportunities where we can do these data-related capabilities, but also build in from the start ways that we can communicate the results of our project in ways that are accessible to everybody. From academics down to, children in the community, everybody. So that's kind of the goal there. It's not just about data-related capabilities, it's about true partnership and relationships. And then the capabilities spring from that, where people are open to identify things that they're interested in.
Excellent. I hope you're telling everyone that, because that's another sledgehammer moment, right? Because I can sit up here and I can say this until the cows come home. It's people like yourself who need to very publicly, in all spaces that are afforded to you, to do that and say just that. What a very, lovely summation and example of that too. It's uncomplicated. And, the value add of people like yourself in your position who are non-Indigenous, who look like yourself, you're able to progress things faster. It's just the fact. It's just the truth, right?
Can I?
Yeah.
To that. I mean this respectfully, because I have a lot of white friends. Being a bit cheeky, in good faith. A lot might go, oh, there's that fragility thing come out. What's my place? Oh, I don't want to, do I overstep or do I over? And they might sit in and they might stay silent because they feel they're not, there's no black fellas here. It's not my place to overstep or whatever. And what they get confused a lot with is, if you're not a black fella, you can't represent that view or that perspective, right? But all of this stuff, if you're working with Indigenous data, it is incumbent upon you to do the right thing. This is not necessarily representing a specific or localized view. This is doing what's right for you to have that sledgehammer moment and actually say, no, I don't know the answer, but I know this is not right. And there's no blackfellas here, or this needs to, hang on, stop until we go out and we get the information, you know, to make a decision, informed decision making. We need to go and do that. You might be the person who blows the whistle and actually says, no, stop and do that. And sometimes, and I've been there, you know, when you're lonely blackfella on a board too. And you say, excuse me, I've got a concern I want to raise, and everyone goes, no progress here, this one, I'm going to hold us up. I know that feeling, and that feeling could be pushed on you too. But does that I hope that makes sense. Don't feel compelled or uncomfortable with the fact that you're not Indigenous and you can't represent that view. That is, although that is true, yes, it is still incumbent upon you to do what is right. And so when we're talking about Indigenous data governance and standards around this, it is absolutely your role to be loud, to be vocal, to jump up and down about it. For example, I have a colleague who gets asked, you know, you work with Indigenous data, you can give us the view. What do we do about this? They talk to her as if she's a blackfella. She will jump up and down and say, well, actually, no, this is the way we've got to do it. So she might not necessarily give the specific or the localised view, but she gives the process, the procedural view. She puts that structure around there and says, no, this is the way. Sometimes it's about as simple as saying, I don't know exactly what the answer is, but I know how to get there, and assert that. And the way of getting there is getting blackfellas in the room as well. Before we go to wrap up, I just want to get, we're not going to get through all four, I'm sorry, but is there anyone who has thought about any of those four aspects, even if we want to jump to that matrix again, and share, who's compelled to just share an example with us, who's been sitting on one? One right up the back, that's good, that hand flew up.
Well, it kind of underpins all of it, and I was saving it for the ecosystem. It's about challenging our mindsets and how we think about things, because we're actually not going to actually be able to make change unless we actually change the way we think. So.
Love that.
And of course, on the back of that, we are all socialised to think, feel and behave based on our experiences in life and where we have come from. And if you were born in Australia and you have gone to school in Australia and you are over the age of 30, you perhaps were not given an accurate representation of our history when you went to school.
And that's where diversity comes in. Yep. Sharing, listening. Oh, sharing, listening. There you go.
Thank you.
Listening mostly.
I think on that, because you know you want to get out in time, on that note, let's close this exercise, and I want to thank the audience for participating in that particular one, but don't clap just yet, because we have got a few things that we just need to say in closing. Now, if you, can you go next slide? And one more there. So this is coming up. This is International Data Week, which is here in Brisbane. Very exciting this year, and you all seem to be Brisbane folks, so that's deadly, or not. I mean, I've made an assumption. How ignorant of me. But perhaps something you might be interested in. The other thing I did want to promote again was coming up in this beautiful venue here, the State Library of Queensland will be doing very shortly their Indigenous Languages Symposium, and there is a save the date. It will be in April 2025, and the event brings together language speakers, experts, industry leaders, all the rest of it. So I know there was some working with language and cultural data. That might be something that you're interested in. Also too, they have an expression of interest out at the moment and a call for speakers for that event too. So that might be of interest. A lot of this stuff we can put in your welcome pack or a follow-up, a thank you email at the end. But to our final slide, and I want to push, go on there and do the feedback form, would you? Come on, take 5 minutes before you go. Well, we should lock the door, lock them in here. But before we go, and you can do this while I'm talking because I think it will take you no time at all. But before we go, I think it's important to acknowledge that there are an enormous amount of work that happens behind the scenes, and I hope if this day felt like it was somewhat well curated or organised, well, that is a fallacy. Because no, again, there's a lot of work that went on to make it feel like that, and Levi and I could not deliver a session without all of that happening in the background. So, in particular, I want to thank Kit from ARDC, who's been Chief Wrangler for all of this stuff. Thank you very much, Kit. But I also want to thank and acknowledge, and there is a big list of people which I'm sorry I can't read out, but I'll say there's a contingent of staff who are based at the ARDC, at UQ, the LDACA program at the University of Melbourne, those involved with the IIRC, and also the staff at the State Library of Queensland, absolutely all of them, ranging from the venue staff and the ones who run us through the tours upstairs going into collections. So for all of those staff, truly grateful for your support of this event, and also to, I think most importantly, or equally as importantly, well, I'll thank my colleague, and I guess I'll thank myself along that. Levi, thank you. Us both, we work well together and certainly enjoy the stress. But to finish it, I want to thank you all as participants of this event. It is, what, as I said at the start, and I'll say again, the success of this event and the value of it is truly hinged on what you bring into this room, your own experiences, and what you are willing to share with us, because that is what makes for rich conversation as these bodies of work continue. And my advice to you as we continue down this journey of building a strong and competent Indigenous data ecosystem is it does not finish today. This is the first conversation. Keep talking, keep asking questions, keep engaging respectfully with each other. Levi? And I forgot. Oh my goodness. I'm very sorry.
He's going to get a hiding.
I'm going to get a hiding.
I'm going to give him a hiding.
Who spent all that time out there with the collections too. I must thank them also very much. And thank you to Alana, who sat on our panel today as well from AIATSIS. Thank you also. Levi, do you have anything in closing?
Yeah, no, other than just the fact that I can't encourage people enough to engage with IATSIS. They are, a significant institute, and the role that they play is, it's hard to describe. It is, of national value, national significance, but more critically, it is a global value. I want you to help encourage people and guide people to IATSIS, guide them to, create opportunity, skill and growth. That stuff can't be done without it. And for me personally, it's just like in this phase of this body of work, it really, really excites me to have IATSIS coming on board with us. It's because I think it's so big, it's so complicated, and it's so ambitious. You really do need all hands on deck. So thank you to the staff that made it happen, and coming up here and ensuring that we had multiple different activities. Like I said, this has been the biggest class. It's so big that we had to expand and change venue and change approach and everything. So can't say that I thank you enough to everyone.
And my final words in closing, and it is 5 o'clock on the dot. We've brought the time on. I think we've done well with our time. But my final words are Galangan Yina, which is go safely. Thank you all. Stay deadly. And we'll continue these conversations.